They said Lady Evander would never defy his mother. For 2 decades, the Duke had bent perfectly to her will, silent, obedient, carved into exactly the shape she required. So when the Dowager Duchess stood before the entire royal court and commanded him to dismiss the low-born translator who had dared rise above her station, no one expected resistance. What they witnessed instead was the most shocking declaration Valenbroke Palace had seen in a generation. But the truth was, the moment Evander chose Mira over his mother's approval began weeks earlier, in a corridor most nobles never noticed, with words spoken in a language no one else understood. The Valenbroke estate existed as a monument to control. Every marble column stood exactly aligned. Every servant moved through choreographed silence. And at its center sat the Dowager Duchess Celeste, a woman who had spent 40 years transforming influence into absolute authority. Her son, Duke Evander, was her greatest achievement. Educated at the finest institutions, fluent in diplomacy, handsome in the distant way statues are handsome. He managed the family's vast holdings with flawless efficiency, attended every necessary function, and had never once in his 28 years made a decision his mother disapproved of. Because disapproval from Celeste was not anger. It was winter itself, a coldness that could last months, a withdrawal of affection so complete it left people desperate to earn their way back. Evander had learned early. Obedience meant warmth. Deviation meant exile. The translators arrived during preparation for the Autumn Concord, a gathering of foreign diplomats that would determine trade agreements affecting half the continent. Valenbroke had been chosen to host, and the Dowager Duchess intended the event to remind everyone exactly which family still mattered. Mira was hired alongside 4 others, specialists in languages most nobles couldn't place on a map. She was 26, composed without stiffness, and possessed the particular grace of someone who had learned to navigate powerful rooms by becoming invisible within them. She wore simple gray dresses, kept her dark hair pinned back, spoke only when translation required it. For the first week, Evander never noticed her at all. Then came the incident with Ambassador Korov. The man was brilliant, ruthless, and had been deliberately speaking his native tongue during negotiations, a language he believed no one at Valenbroke understood. His words, laced with insults about Evander's decorative nobility and the puppet duke controlled by his mother's strings, were meant only for his own delegation. Except Mira heard every word. She stood near the wall, hands folded, expression unchanged. But when Korov laughed at a particularly cutting remark, something shifted in her stillness. Evander noticed that shift. During the next break, he approached her directly. "You speak Taveshi." It wasn't a question. Mira met his gaze briefly. "Yes, Your Grace." "And you understood what the ambassador said?" A pause. "Yes." "Yet you remained silent." "Translation was not requested," she said simply. "And some truths are more useful unspoken." The answer surprised him. Most people either rushed to expose insults or denied hearing them entirely. Mira had done neither. She had made a strategic choice. "What would you suggest?" he asked quietly. She considered him with calm directness. "Let him believe his advantage. Then respond in Taveshi during tomorrow's session. Briefly, just enough to prove you've heard everything." Evander felt something unfamiliar stir, not attraction yet, but recognition. The realization that someone in his own household understood power more clearly than the advisors who spoke constantly. He followed her advice. When Ambassador Korov made another veiled insult the next day, Evander replied in flawless Taveshi, a single sentence agreeing to terms, delivered with perfect accent. The ambassador's face went carefully blank. The entire negotiation shifted. Afterward, the Dowager Duchess summoned Evander privately. "That was well done," she said, her approval warm and deliberate. "Though I trust you'll remember that cleverness should always appear to originate from you alone, not from staff." The message was clear. Success was his. Credit belonged upward, never outward. But Evander found himself seeking Mira's perspective again and again. It began practically. A question about phrasing, a cultural nuance, the proper way to address a minor duchess from the southern provinces. Mira answered each inquiry with the same quiet precision, never overstepping, never claiming importance. Yet her insights were consistently sharper than those from advisors twice her age. Somewhere between the trade negotiations and the final banquet preparations, the conversations changed. They spoke longer. About more than diplomacy. He asked where she'd learned languages. She described years spent in port cities, listening, studying, surviving on competence alone. No family, he asked once. Not anymore, she said simply. No elaboration. No request for pity. The strength in that brevity struck him harder than any dramatic confession could have. And one evening, standing in the library while she translated a particularly difficult contract, Evander realized he was no longer noticing her efficiency. He was noticing her, the way she tilted her head when thinking, the faint smile when she caught an idiom's double meaning, the steadiness that never wavered regardless of who entered the room. It terrified him, because his mother was already watching. The Dowager Duchess did not confront problems. She pruned them before they could bloom. Evander first sensed her awareness during a formal dinner when Celeste smiled at him across the table and said, "The translators have been quite useful, though I imagine we'll hardly need them once the Concord concludes." The statement was garden party light. The meaning beneath was iron. Mira's contract would not be renewed. That night, Evander stood at his window and felt the old, familiar cold creeping in. The warning that deviation carried consequences, that his mother's approval was the foundation everything else rested upon. He told himself it was practical. Mira would find other work. He would continue managing the estate flawlessly. Nothing needed to change. But the next morning, when he saw Mira translating correspondence in the Sumlet study, something in his chest pulled tight with a feeling he'd spent 28 years learning to ignore. What? Not for distraction or rebellion, but for the quiet miracle of her presence. The way she made even Valenbroke's coldest rooms feel less empty. He tried maintaining distance. Failed. Because Mira never sought him out, never angled for favor, and somehow that made her impossible to forget. She remained exactly what she'd always been. Competent, unassuming, content in her role. Which meant if anything changed, the choice would have to be his. The breaking point came 3 days before the Autumn Concord's final gala. The Dowager Duchess entered the translation room unannounced and found Evander and Mira alone, reviewing a diplomat's correspondence. They stood closer than strictly necessary. Their conversation carried the ease of people who had stopped performing formality. Nothing improper was happening. Everything about it looked dangerous. Celeste's expression remained perfectly pleasant. Evander, a word. He followed her into the hallway. "You've become quite reliant on Miss Dane," his mother said quietly. "She's exceptionally skilled. She is staff." Celeste's tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. "And you are the Duke of Valenbroke. People notice where your attention falls. There's nothing inappropriate. Appearance matters more than truth." She placed one hand on his arm, the gesture almost affectionate. "I've arranged for her contract to end after the gala. Quietly, generously. She'll leave with excellent references." Evander's throat tightened. "That's unnecessary. It's practical." Celeste's eyes softened in the way that always preceded her most devastating statements. "You've worked so hard to build respect, darling. I won't let you compromise it over sentiment." The word landed like a blade. Because sentiment was what weak men indulged. Sentiment was what his father had shown before drinking himself into an early grave. Sentiment was the thing Celeste had spent decades teaching Evander to master. "I understand," he heard himself say. His mother smiled. "I knew you would." But that night, Evander couldn't sleep. He kept thinking of Mira's hands translating contracts, her voice steady in 5 languages, the way she'd once told him that some truths were more useful unspoken. Except silence, he was beginning to realize, had its own cost. The night before the gala, he found Mira in the garden. She stood near the fountain, moonlight catching in her dark hair. When she noticed him, she straightened slightly, not with fear, but with the careful awareness of someone who understood boundaries. "Your Grace, do you need something translated?" "No." He stepped closer. "I need your honesty." She waited. "If you could choose anywhere to go after this week," he said carefully, "where would it be?" Mira studied him with that unnerving directness. "Why does it matter?" "Because I'm trying to determine whether keeping you here would be selfish or—" He stopped. Started again. "My mother has arranged for your contract to end." Something flickered across her expression. Not surprise. Resignation. "I expected that," she said quietly. "And you'll simply accept it?" "What choice do I have?" There was no bitterness in the question. Just reality. "Your world has rules I can't change, Your Grace." "I've always known that." The calm in her voice broke something in him. Because she wasn't asking him to save her, wasn't demanding anything. She had already accepted her own invisibility, the same invisibility he'd been taught to maintain his entire life. What if the rules are wrong? He said. Mira's breath caught. Evander. Hearing his name without the title felt like falling and flying simultaneously. What if I don't want you to leave? The words came raw, unpolished. What if I haven't been able to stop thinking about you for weeks? What if the only time I feel like myself is when? She kissed him. It was brief, fierce, and entirely improper. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. Then we'll have one night, she whispered, before reality returns. But Evander was done with reality as his mother defined it. No, he said. We'll have more than that. The Autumn Concord's final gala transformed Valenbroke into a glittering stage where every movement carried political weight. Ambassadors mingled beneath crystal chandeliers. Nobles exchanged carefully pleasant bars. And at the room's center, the Dowager Duchess Celeste presided with the satisfied air of someone whose plans were unfolding exactly as designed. Mira was meant to remain invisible, translating quietly when needed, then disappearing into dismissal the next morning. Instead, she stood beside Evander at the hall's entrance, wearing a gown he'd commissioned in Valenbroke blue, her hand resting lightly on his offered arm. The room's hum fractured into shocked silence. Celeste's expression remained composed, but her eyes went cold as winter stone. She crossed the floor with terrifying grace. Evander, she said softly. A word. Now. He didn't move. Anything you wish to say can be said here, mother. Her smile tightened. You're making a spectacle. No, I'm making a choice. Celeste's gaze flicked to Mira with venomous assessment before returning to her son. You will dismiss this girl immediately, or I will do it for you. The threat hung in the air, absolute, familiar, usually enough to ensure obedience. Evander felt the old fear rise. 28 years of conditioning screamed at him to submit, to apologize, to step back into the shape his mother required. Then he felt Mira's hand steady against his arm, not pulling him forward, not demanding anything, just present. And he realized the coldness he'd feared his entire life only had power if he kept seeking the warmth on the other side. No, he said quietly. Celeste went very still. What did you say? I said no. His voice strengthened. Mira stays. Not as a translator. As my betrothed. The room erupted. Gasps rippled outward. Ambassadors exchanged stunned glances. Nobles whispered frantically behind gloved hands. But Evander heard none of it. Because his mother's face had gone blank with shock, the first time in his life he'd seen her completely unguarded. You cannot be serious, she breathed. I've never been more certain of anything. She is nobody. Celeste's composure cracked just slightly. No family, no title, no. She is more herself than I've ever been. Evander interrupted. She doesn't perform, doesn't manipulate. She simply exists with a strength I've spent my entire life pretending to have. Mira's eyes filled, but she remained silent, letting him speak. Celeste stepped closer, her voice dropping to the deadly whisper she used before destroying people. If you do this, you will lose everything I've built for you. Every alliance. Every ounce of respect. You will be diminished. Then I'll be diminished. He met her gaze steadily. But I'll finally be free. For a long moment, mother and son stared at each other across an unbridgeable distance. Then Celeste turned and walked from the hall without another word. Her exit, so controlled it somehow felt more damning than rage. The silence she left behind was suffocating. Until Ambassador Korov, of all people, began to laugh. Well, he said in lightly accented common tom, I did not expect this evening to become interesting. The tension broke slightly. A few nervous chuckles followed. And Evander realized that scandal, while uncomfortable, was survivable. What would have destroyed him was a lifetime of choosing safety over truth. He turned to Mira. I should have asked properly. She smiled through tears. Asked what? He knelt before the entire court. Mira Dane, will you marry me? Not because it's practical or appropriate, but because you're the only person who's ever made me want to be more than what I was told to be. She pulled him to his feet and kissed him in front of 300 witnesses. The room erupted again, but this time, some of the applause sounded genuine. 6 months later, Mira stood in the Valenbroke library wearing a simple wedding band, translating correspondence, while Evander managed estate business beside her. The Dowager Duchess had relocated to the Southern Holdings. She sent coldly formal letters occasionally. Evander responded with equal formality. The law still ached sometimes, but it was the clean pain of honesty, not the slow poison of performance. Ambassador Korov sent another trade proposal, Mira said, sliding the document across the desk. Evander scanned it, then smiled. He's testing whether marriage has made me sentimental in negotiations. Has it? Absolutely. He pulled her into his lap. I've become completely unreasonable about keeping you happy. She laughed against his shoulder. The other nobles still think I bewitched you. You did, he said seriously, by being exactly who you were. No performance. No pretense. Just you. Mira kissed him softly. And you freed both of us by finally being yourself. Outside, autumn leaves drifted past the windows. The estate ran as efficiently as ever. But now the corridors held laughter. The dinners felt warm. And for the first time in his life, Evander understood that love wasn't the weakness his mother had warned against. It was the strength he'd been missing all along.